I'd like to welcome you to another Todd Talk, where we take teaching theory and turn it into teaching practice. In keeping with our theme of teaching in a virtual setting, we are at a point in the school year where uh, some are teaching virtually, some are teaching in a hybrid form, some are teaching face to face. But in a lot of cases, teachers are having to figure out ways to use good teaching methods in a virtual setting. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is how to differentiate in a virtual setting. So the first thing I need to do is define what differentiation is, because there's a lot of theories about differentiation, a lot of ideas, but I want to frame it in what it looks like in gifted. So differentiation is just different kids have different learning needs and different learning styles. Because of these differences, we can't teach them all the same way. The traditional method of teaching everyone in the class the exact same way and hoping those who are behind catch up and those who are ahead will slow down is not the best practice for trying to educate children. So what we have to do is we have to identify times that we can differentiate, either to challenge students on one end of the spectrum or differentiate at the other end of the spectrum by scaffolding and getting kids to where they need to be. In the gifted world, what differentiation looks like is giving kids options, giving them different questions, giving them different assignments, all those things that are going to challenge the student where they're at. Because there are some gifted students that will come to you that have a vast array of knowledge or background information, and what you're planning on teaching them is just going to be review. And no one likes to sit through review of things that they already know. So are there things you can be doing differently that are going to allow that student to be challenged, maybe on the same topic, but at a deeper level? So that's what differentiation looks like in gifted. And so what we have to figure out are, in a virtual setting, how can we offer some of these differentiation opportunities? So I'm going to talk about 5 different strategies that you might use when trying to differentiate in a virtual setting. So the first strategy I'm going to talk about and how you can differentiate in a virtual classroom setting is differentiating the bell ringers. So a bell ringer is a question that you give to students at the beginning of the day or the beginning of class, and it usually does one of 3 things. The first thing it does is it introduces new material, or kind of gives kids a flavor for what they're going to be doing, either this class or coming up classes or whatever. So if you're introducing a brand new concept, you might ask them a question to just kind of as like a pre-assessment to see what they know about it, or to get them excited about it. So it would be used to generate interest and kind of show students where you're going to be taking this lesson. The second reason why you use a bell ringer is for review. So say kids have been working on something for the past couple of days and you want to check for understanding, or you just want to make sure that they aren't forgetting what it is that they're learning, then you might have a bell ringer that acts as review. So when they're taking that, they're showing you, yes, I continue to understand this, even though we've been working on it for several days. The final thing that a bell ringer might do is be kind of like a check for understanding. So in other words, you may have moved on from something and then you kind of want to revisit it. You want to make sure that students still have it. So this is just kind of a check for understanding. And that can be in a pre-assessment form too. Like, do kids understand what it is that you're going to be learning about? But what this might look like in a differentiated classroom is you would give kids different bell ringers depending upon what you know about them, what their capabilities are, and what they've showed you they're capable of. So for example, let's say that you're trying to teach multiplication to students. So if you have kids that are just getting the concept of multiplication, it's being introduced to them for the very first time, your bell ringer might be a simple 1-digit multiplication problem. 8 times 8 is what? And you're just trying to get them to the idea of what multiplication looks like, or 2 times 3, or something like that. If students have shown that they get multiplication already, you might want to give them a bell ringer that has a multi-digit multiplication, so 24 times 17, and have them work on that. In this way, they're putting into practice what they already know, but it's kind of pushing them to the next level. The third student differentiation, what it might look like is you give them a multiplication word problem where they're having to take information out of the problem and some of it they need, some of it they don't, and they're going to have to use this information of the word problem to construct their own multiplication problem. And this multiplication problem should be, multi-digit or more complex than just a simple multiplication problem. But this is then getting students to kind of think outside the box a little bit, not just the straightforwardness of the multiplication, but how you would use that in the real world, what that would look like in a situation, and so on and so forth. So what this might look like in a virtual classroom is you have three different Bellringers that you assign to kids. You could go to Google Classroom and you can push that out to the appropriate kids. Maybe you use a pre-assessment to determine who's ready for what, or maybe you just know what the math ability of your students is. But what you do is you give them different Bellringers. And then what you're doing is that you're meeting them where they're at and where they're capable of going. And this is going to challenge kids who are ready to be challenged. It's going to allow kids who need a little more time to work on that. And even though three different sets of kids are working on three different sets of problems, those problems are specifically meeting the needs of those students. And it may be more than three. You may have to differentiate 5 different ways depending upon what you're doing. So if you're having students, you're trying to get an understanding of their comprehension, you might want to give a kid who's maybe at the lower end of the spectrum when it comes to differentiation, you might want to give them a real simple passage. A second student, you might give like a at grade level passage that they can read. And then for the higher ability student, you might give them above grade level. It doesn't mean that the piece is longer necessarily. It just means that the level of the reading is at a higher level or at that level or a lower level, so that the level of what they're doing is differentiated. So that is the first way that you can differentiate in a virtual classroom, is by having Bellringers that are different according to different abilities of your students. Strategy you might consider in a virtual setting is how you're going to assess for mastery and what that's going to look like. In a traditional classroom, what typically happens is students are given one assessment. Everyone in the class is given the exact same assessment, and they do that assessment, and then that's evaluated, and it determines whether they have mastered what it is that you've wanted them to master. But what if you gave them some choice in the assessment that they were doing? What if you gave them options? And in a virtual setting, you would give them options that would allow them to use their technology that they're using. So you can see right here, this is a reading response choice board. So basically, at the very middle on Google Classroom, this teacher has placed a story that they want the students to read. So the students are going to read these. And then they are given 3 different activities that show that they have read this, that they comprehended this, that they understand it, that they understand it on a higher level. But it's giving them choices. So you see there are various technological choices. They could create a Powtoon, which is a program that allows them to create like a cartoon. And so it could be told from another character's point of view. And they could create a Google form that has 3 really important questions that they wonder about the story. So this is kind of allowing them to be inquisitive and to think about, creative ways of asking questions about this particular story. It could be that you have them create a 2-minute book trailer that gives you a basic understanding of the story and that shows you that they've comprehended it. So what you can see here is that there's various different types of assessment, and each of them may assess something differently. What I mean by that is one may assess just at a basic level, one may show deeper understanding, such as the questioning one. Some may just be very straightforward. So this is something that you could definitely put in your virtual classroom and give those students choices. This could be done for any subject area, but in a virtual classroom especially, you're going to have a lot of technological choices. So you'll want to be familiar with programs that students can use, and be open-minded to the fact that students might bring in technology that you're not familiar with. So they may say, oh, I don't see Flipgrid on here. I would really like to do a Flipgrid video that shows this or whatever. And so being open to that and being willing to learn some new technologies is going to be really crucial when you're differentiating in a virtual classroom. A third way that you can differentiate in a virtual classroom is the expectations that you have of students. So what I mean by that is when you're assessing for mastery or you're assessing for understanding, are you are your expectations different according to different students? I'm not saying to penalize some students for one thing that you're not penalizing someone for another one. What I am saying is offering students the opportunity or the choice to go above and beyond. And so what you can do is you can set up your rubrics to show this. So here's an example of one rubric here where this is called a single item rubric, where it has just the mastery level. So it tells students this is what you need to do the bare requirements of this particular assignment or whatever. And if you do these things, then you have successfully showed mastery. However, if you are able to go above and beyond that, then you might want to push past just showing mastery and see if you can add. So it gives you a blank space where it says shows initiative. And this is for kids who are going above and beyond. So maybe they just didn't, when it says like turned in all materials by the deadline and pace self well, getting a little done every day. Showing initiative with their time management might be that they are not only they're getting done early and then adding on other work that they can add to make it better. That would be showing initiative. And then, of course, for the student who maybe is not where they need to be quite yet to determine mastery, you have a way that you can show progress. So as the teacher, you would put notes in this showing initiative part or the showing progress part if a student falls into that. And that would be written feedback for them. And then you would also want to go over it with them so that they understand where they fell on that particular rubric. Here's a second type of rubric. And this is on taking notes. And so what you have here is kind of the same, similar thing, but it defines what above and beyond means. So you have your mastered link or mastered category, you still need some work, and then you're above and beyond. So it says, look, if you've mastered it, your handwriting is legible to where you can read almost anything. If you've gone above and beyond, the handwriting is legible where you can read everything. There's no mistaking something. And so that's kind of above and beyond. Same thing, it has that for organization and content as well. So the expectations are, and just throwing those expectations out there that students realize, hey, I don't just need to stop at point B. I can go to point C, point D, point E, and so on and so forth. And that the teacher has this expectation, is giving me the space in the room in order to meet this expectation. Some students will take you up on this. Some won't. But as the teacher, you also want to encourage some kids who maybe you feel can go above and beyond to try that, to attempt that. It's that whole teaching our students to fail. So teaching students to go for above and beyond. If they don't make it, they're still okay because they're in the mastered part and they've done what was been required of them. And by failing, they don't fail. By failing, they just don't deliver above and beyond of what was expected. You would post these rubrics in your LMS, in your virtual setting before students start an assignment so that they understand that here are the expectations of the bare minimum of what I'm expecting. If you're going to go above and beyond that, this is what this might look like, or you can use the mastery as a kind of a jumping off point for how you can take that further. And so these need to be placed, like I said, on your learning management system before students start the assignment, so they're well aware of the expectations. And they're well aware of the expectation that you are expecting some students to go above and beyond, that students that can handle it are able to do that. The fourth differentiation strategy I want to talk about is the idea of questioning. And in a virtual setting, this can be tricky because you're not having as much face-to-face interaction with students. You are not having necessarily the day-to-day conversations because you might see them one day but not another. But know that there are ways to alter the questioning that you're doing. Whether it's in your day-to-day practices, whether it's in a Bellringer, whether it's in an assessment, whether it's in anything that you do, you can change the question according to the student. So let me give you an example of what this might look like. Here are 3 questions that you might ask students. These could be questions that you ask them on an assessment. It could be you ask them to write in an online journal, like using a Google Doc. It could be that you're asking them to put together a Google slide that answers these questions. however you're choosing to do this, the questions are different, but they're actually asking kind of the same information. It's just the level of thinking that students are using. So, for example, what are 5 reasons the colonists were able to defeat the British in the American Revolution? This is a comprehension application question where students either read about it in the book or heard you talk about it in a lecture or talked about it with classmates and what they saw. And they're just restating what it is that they heard. They're not putting any spin on it. They're not putting any really of their own thinking into that. They're just restating information that they heard. The second question is choose the 3 most important reasons why you think the colonists were able to be successful in the American Revolution and justify your decisions. So now students are having to analyze and justify or evaluate. So in this case, there are many reasons why the colonists were able to win, but students must weigh these against one another and compare and contrast them, and then make a decision based upon their own thinking and the information that they have of which had the biggest impact, which were the most important. And then they'd have to explain justify what the decision that they made. They'd have to say, I chose this because of this or whatever, this really had this. And so kids are taking the same information of reasons why the colonists beat the British, but they're kind of putting their own thinking into it, and they're taking it to the next level and ranking these in order of importance. The third question is what might have happened differently that caused the British to win the American Revolution, and how might things be different as a result? This is that what if question. So now we're getting into the creating. So what students have to do here is they still are going to have to think about reasons the colonists were able to defeat the British, and then either take those reasons away or alter them or give a situation where they were not as successful as they really were. So they're going to have to take that information and kind of create an alternate reality and what might have happened and how might things be different as a result. Again, they're taking the same information of how were the colonists able to defeat the British, but now they're getting to create what that might look like had things gone differently. So 3 questions, all pretty much asking the same content, but the level of thinking is very different. And this is the big difference in differentiating your questions. It's not about making your questions more difficult. We often use the word rigor to describe, challenging students. Rigor is not about making it more complex and more difficult. It's about changing the thinking that the students are doing or giving students another way to think about this. And so that's what these questions do. There are various levels of thinking. So if you have a student who, just is getting the basics, you might want to give them the first question. If you have a student that's really grasping it really well and can think about a what if situation, you might want to give them that third question. And how you roll this out is completely up to you. You could give them all 3 of these questions and ask them to choose. So you're giving the students the opportunity to differentiate themselves. So a kid may say, well, that question really appeals to me. I want to do that type of thinking. When another student might be just very, very straightforward and say, I just want to take that first question and answer that one. Or you could assign these questions. As the teacher, you could say, you 7 students, you're going to do the first one. 5 students, you're going to do the second one, and so on and so forth. And you may not announce that kids are doing different questions. You just give it to them based upon, what you've seen in the classroom and what they're able to handle. A 5th differentiation strategy would be the use of project-based learning. Project-based learning lends itself to a virtual setting. You just have to break it down, and you have to determine what is it that you, the teacher, still needs to be responsible for either teaching the student or pointing them in the right direction, and then what can they do independently on their own. And then what you do is then you have to decide how you're going to place it in your LMS system. So here's an LMS system that a lot of people use, which is Google Classroom. So for this particular project, building your own fort, what I had to do is I had to break it down into parts so that students can see the progression of how to work on the project. So I had an introduction to the building of their fort. And so if you went on that, then there was a video of me explaining what the project was. There was a syllabus so that students were clear on what the expectations were, and included with that was a rubric. Then I gave them the opportunity to kind of explore different types of forts using YouTube videos. So I linked these videos. I also encouraged them to find examples of their own. Then what the learning objectives of this is to learn what perimeter and area are. So I want to be able to check that. So I have a video on how perimeter works, and then students will have a assignment to determine that they have shown what perimeter looks, that they know what perimeter looks like and how it works. Similarly with area, I have a video here that has an explanation of what area is, and then an assignment for them to show mastery. Then they do have to do a design. So I have these hints for how to do a design. And then at the end, again, I have the rubric for building the fort, so students know what the expectation is. But I had to break this down and on my LMS system and figure out how to deliver these in a virtual setting. So in a lot of cases, I did videos or I linked to documents. But what I was doing is using the LMS system that I had in order to roll this out and let students have access to it. And so they can see the big picture then. So what happens with some students is when you work on projects especially, is they can't see the big picture. They only see what's immediately in front of them. So this gives them a clear progression of what they're going to be going through. The question becomes then, how is project-based learning differentiated? Well, the nice thing about project-based learning is it sort of differentiates itself. So if you set up the project correctly, students should be able to enter at whatever level they are currently at. So for example, if you have a student that's just getting the basics of something, they can enter the project at that point and then take it as far as they're able to take it. And they're certainly not going to get as far as maybe someone who enters the project having a bit of background information about it, and they're starting there and they're moving from that point. So the differentiation comes in that the students can start at different places, and more importantly, they can end up at different places to show mastery. So one student may just show basic mastery, student may be able to show above and beyond that, or going much deeper, or going to places that you hadn't intended for them to go, which are really neat places for them to explore. So that's how project-based learning lends itself to differentiation, and how you can set it up on your learning management system so that students can do projects in a virtual learning environment. So there are 5 strategies for what differentiation can look like in a virtual learning environment. I also want to stress that even though I made this specific to a virtual learning environment, these are strategies that can be used in the regular ed classroom as well. They just have to be altered to a face-to-face setting, or you working with students one-on-one, or so on and so forth. So these are just good strategies that can be used for differentiation, period, not just in a virtual setting. With that being said, I want to make sure I also talk about 3 things you should not do to differentiate that I've seen in the past from certain people. The first one is more work. A lot of times what happens is gifted students will finish their work early, or a high ability kid or a motivated kid will finish their work early, and the reward is more work. And what you're doing there is you're punishing that student for their ability. You're punishing them for getting done early by giving them even more work. And so what a kid will do very quickly is they will figure out, if I slow down and work at the pace as everyone else, I'm not going to get extra work. So that's what I'm going to start doing. So you need to make sure that you're not just giving them more work. It should be different work. So if you give students 15 math problems to work on, and that gifted kid nails the first 5 right away, then stop them right there. Don't make them do the other 10 that are more of the same. Give them 10 different problems that are going to take it to the next level. So maybe it is another step in what it is that they're learning. Or maybe you're asking them to create something. But the idea here is that you are not just giving them more work, you're getting them different work, which is the root of differentiation, is different. The second thing that you should not do is just add volume to something, or extend, or change the deadline because someone is you're trying to differentiate for someone. So let me tell you what this looks like. So for example, you might say to a student who is basic, you might want to say, you only have to read 10 pages of this. For the gifted students, you have to read 20 pages of this. So again, you're just giving them more. It's not the same. What you might want to do instead to differentiate is maybe give those students different books at different levels, reading levels. It's the same amount of volume, but the understanding that they have to have is going to be very different. Another one I've seen is the deadline. So what they'll do is they'll say, okay, if you are a regular ed student, your paper is due on Wednesday. If you're one of the honor students or gifted students, your paper is going to be due Monday. Other than that, nothing has changed about the assignments, only the deadline. So that, again, you're punishing students for being gifted or being high ability students, and we don't want to do that. We want to get out of the habit of punishing them for their gifts. So make sure that you're not just giving them more volume or giving them an earlier deadline. Those are not good differentiation tools. So you would not want to do this. The third no-no in differentiation, and it can be really tempting in a virtual setting, is just to put work on and expect the gifted students, just to do that work without any support. I think a lot of times what happens is we're like, whether they're gifted kids, they can handle it. I've got much bigger problems to worry about down here. Oftentimes teachers are forced to make decisions and triaging where the biggest problems are, and they're going and solving those problems. And so the gifted kids are just left alone. Now, sometimes there are cases where you want to leave them alone and not micromanage them, but at the same time, you don't want to ignore them. You have to make sure that you are giving them some attention, that you're making that connection with them. So in a virtual setting, what you want to make sure you do is you're checking in with those students from time to time and having conversations. It can be something as simple as an email. It could be having office hours, and they can come to a Google Meet or a Zoom meeting. You can talk with them, but just to kind of see where they're at, and then the main goal is to push them to that next level, because some students don't know how to do that themselves necessarily. And so, can you take that gifted student who is doing the bare minimum and get them to those to consider those other choices where they're going to be thinking, at a higher level, or they're going to be doing work that is more challenging, and it's going to be really forcing them or helping them to grow as learners rather than just stagnant because they're just doing the status quo. So the final question becomes, where do you get this information in order to make decisions about differentiation? One thing you don't want to do is just assume they're gifted, I'm going to differentiate them at the higher levels. Or at the other end, they're special ed, so I'm going to give them the most simple. I mean, there are special ed students that can handle those questions better than a gifted student, and other way around as well. So you have to take information in and then make decision as a teacher. And there are three places where you can find this information. One is in the data. So this might be, if they're doing a diagnostic test online, you get information from that, or you give them a pre-assessment, or, things of that nature where there's actual hardcore data that you can look at that gives you an indication of what the student's ability level is. And then taking them above or meeting them there and then taking them above what that level is. So using data would be the first source of information. The second source of information would be past performance. So this is not just past performance in your class. This can be past performance in other classes as well, or in other years. So, just having conversations with those teachers and, how did they handle this? How did they do this? And trying to get a feel for how students, in the past have, how they've behaved or how they've performed. And this will give you an idea that this student can really handle independence because they've shown that in the past. So I'm going to give them an independent project to work on here and check in with them occasionally. This student has not shown responsibility in their past performances. So maybe I need to have scaffolds in there where I'm checking with them a little more frequently. And so that past performance can give you information on how you can differentiate. The final one, probably the most important one, is the conversations that you have with kids. And this is why in a virtual setting, it is so important to make connections with your kids, whether it be, just a little conversation here or, having face-to-face, as much as possible, face-to-face interactions with your students in the virtual setting so that you can ask questions and get a feel for their understanding of something through their responses. Because kids can fake it on an assessment if it's a written assessment or something of that nature. But when you're talking to them, you're going to get a really good picture of what they're capable of. And so finding a place and making time to have those conversations is really important in any classroom, but especially in a virtual classroom where you can be shut off from them because you are, talking between a computer screen rather than getting to sit down and have that one-on-one conversation face to face. So as teachers, we need to make sure that we're making those connections with our students, and then using that information that we get to decide how we're going to differentiate with our students.